is that a floor plan with interior walls, not something appraisers have ever done, is required to complete a desktop assignment.
And I think there was one mortgage broker who said, yeah, I know this is coming. There are probably 5 or 6 others that I've talked to, whether in passing or whatever, that have no idea what we're talking about.
Well, episode 14, Jeff, of Market Moves with Mark and Jeff here. Excited to jump back into it with you this week. Slower news week. We had the enormous rate drops last week, and not a lot's happened since that. So it's a little bit slower news week, and looking forward to talking a little bit about the market here, but also kind of diving deep into some real estate valuation topics centered around some of the GSE, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac initiatives in the execution, well or poor, and kind of market participants out here. How do we see those things happening in the marketplace right now? But first, let's jump in, Jeff, to the market overall, macro economy, and how are we doing post rate drop?
Yeah, so it's been something of a nothing burger. It feels like. I think that the mortgage market had priced in, an expectation of a rate drop, and so what I think we're seeing, at least on the appraisal side, which is reflective of the overall transactions taking place in the market, as far as I can tell, is simply that we're not seeing a drastic increase in appraisal orders being coming through. That maybe the only notable difference that we've observed in the last couple of weeks is we're seeing a little bit more in the way of orders from lending clients that maybe we haven't seen from in the past. A little bit more diversity of where those requests are coming from for the appraisals. But I've been a little bit surprised. Maybe I shouldn't have been. I kind of expected we'd see more of a move in just the overall number of appraisals being requested, and that just not a whole lot of movement on that front yet.
Yeah, seeing the same thing here, of course, Jeff. And I think a couple of news pieces that I saw over the last week that might speak to some of this. We've talked about on multiple episodes that these rate drops, although were larger than expected, at least in my own mind, were priced in before the rate drops occurred. And rates, I think, were at like 30-year mortgage rates were at 6.15%. This morning when I looked, we're recording Thursday morning, 6.19%. So they've just not moved at all. And that means that it was all priced in. But a few news pieces that I took note of this week were Citi's market research report suggesting that maybe an expectation of a hard landing of the economy is what they are looking for and unfortunately predicting. And really speaking to the softness in the job market, that it's just harder for people to find jobs. Are you seeing any anecdotal evidence of that?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I always hate to rely too much on anecdotes because you don't know how reflective they are of the whole out there. But really interestingly, just 2 days ago, my wife was telling me that she's got a friend who has been in an HR role at a company for like 9 years, had been a good company, selling kind of, higher end luxury, like, furnishings and bedding and stuff like that. Well, their company's really struggling right now, which may, speak to a little bit of the softness for the consumer for kind of non-essentials. So he made it through multiple rounds of layoffs, just had been laid off, and has been through multiple rounds of interviews in multiple different companies and not finding, anything. It's frustrating, for him and the family. In fact, they're expecting their third kid, and all of that. But as I look around, as we had posted a job posting a while ago for a potential recruiter or something, we were surprised to be inundated with, way more applicants than we could even go through. And I look at national job report numbers that we're adding more jobs and unemployment is still relatively low, but what I'm seeing on the ground isn't necessarily matching with the data there.
Yeah, it's a good point. And, the overwhelming number of applicants we saw for a recruiter position was 5 or 6 months ago. And I think the job market has gotten materially worse since. Notable in kind of specific predictions from Citi's report was that They expect new jobs to be at 72,000, somewhere in that range, where we've been at 180 to 200, maybe 220. As some of these monthly releases are coming out, this is the prediction of the September report. So that'll come in early October, describing what happened in September. We've been seeing a lot of high numbers, upwards of 200,000, ultimately getting revised down to 120 or less a lot of times. But 70,000 would be a really low number. And so I think a lot of people are feeling and seeing that pain, both in the economic reports and anecdotally out there. So a hard landing, possibly. We are absolutely seeing the buyers and sellers of residential real estate just sitting on the sidelines. The half-point rate cut and 6.2% rates are not moving them, clearly. So where do we need to get to? We've talked to low fives on this podcast in the last few weeks. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's something different. But the other report, which was, I think, a good summary of new construction, which has been the real winner through the first 3 quarters of 2024, has been the KB Homes quarterly report. What'd you see in that?
Yeah, so it was interesting to see as their CEO had put out some information on it, talking about starting to see an increase in inventory and them actually, just recently competing with existing home inventory that's being put on the market. And he was, I think, careful to say or identifying that this is not, in every market across the country, but in the article I saw referencing specifically Florida and Texas, which have been some of the hottest markets as far as volumes and a lot of inflow from other parts of the country, people moving in from the coasts and that sort of thing. But starting to see that they're having to reevaluate their pricing and adjust some of their pricing to move inventory that they're wanting to bring online. I've kind of felt that this would be the case. We're starting to see it, maybe again anecdotally in this report that they had put out. But as interest rates do get better and start to entice not only buyers into the market, I think you've got a lot of people and most that have owned a home for the last 5 years plus had refinanced when rates were at or very near the bottom, and so very few have wanted to sell a 2 or 3% interest rate mortgage to jump into a 7 or 8% interest rate mortgage. And as you just said, we're down at close to 6 now. I think we're going to have to be in the 5s to have a large impact in the volume taking place. But I do think we start to see a little bit of people saying, hey, maybe it is time to sell. I've been pushing off that decision, not wanting to give up the mortgage that I've got. And I think that's going to bring more inventory to the market, which I don't know if it'll outpace or not keep up with the demand that'll come in with lower rates. But hopefully for anybody in the real estate space, it translates into a higher number of transactions and just more business for all of us at that level.
I'm here in Houston, and I'm doing a lot of appraisal work every week out largely in new construction neighborhoods, in and around new construction neighborhoods on the outskirts of the Houston MSA. And there are 6 or 7 pockets of less than $500,000 median price, generally less than 400,000, where there are 300 or 400 properties on the market for sale in a single subdivision. And there are 6 or 7 pockets of that. And then I've got a build to rent subdivision being built just down the road from me. And so, Robert McGibney, the KB Home CEO, had suggested the phrase that caught my attention was, we are trying to find the market in several different areas around the country. And that to me is lower prices and concessions to compete with that existing inventory that has risen a little bit, but also with a still buyer that isn't moving even when those rates are brought down. So so it's still tough going out there. And I think it won't be tough going sooner rather than later. But part of what Citi's report was an expectation is, hey, hard landing may need to be what we're all preparing for. But if that happens, they would expect panic rate cuts. So you'd have kind of extensive rate cuts coming from the Fed. And whatever it would take to get buyers and sellers to move, I think would be the intention there. And we'll see. I got no idea. I'm certainly not betting on that. But among the possibilities of legitimate onlookers, I think is notable.
Yeah, no doubt. Two thoughts come to mind as you say that. The timing might be interesting as we come into the fall, but then the winter season holidays, which are historically slow times. Not many people are moving on around Christmas time unless they have to. So I wonder if that may exaggerate a little bit of this what we're seeing of buildup of inventory. Maybe that continues through into next year. I remember, and I'm sure you've heard this a million times too. A lot of the old timers, that have been appraising for 3 or 4 decades or more, would say, what we need in the real estate space is a good old fashioned recession, because that's where rates start to get dropped, and then spurring activity in that space. And this hard landing, I don't think is out of the picture. I've seen others on the other side saying, hey, we've achieved the soft landing, like it's almost like mission accomplished. And I'm not as convinced that we're there as what some are saying, and everything's much clearer in retrospect, obviously. But it'll be interesting to see how things play out the next 6 months, because there may be more pain than has been projected generally.
Wild human psychology experiments being played by U.S. monetary policy is the way I see it. It's impossible to predict. Who would have thought that prices would rise during these last 2 years, and here we've been. So interesting. As we leave this topic, I did want Jeff to give credit to a X or Twitter account that aggregates news well. Lance Lambert, I think it's at News Lambert, that I peel off a little bit from at times, because it's a really good aggregation, and the KB Home stuff was there. So just wanted to make sure I give credit to that. Great. Well, setting up the next topic here. So Fannie Mae and Freddie are active in trying to do a lot of things, and have been for decades, right? They are tasked with adding structure and data consistency to this lending process, one way or another, so that they have good, accurate values that they can make lending decisions on. And in that vein, you see a lot of different things, so there is data structure improvements that they're after for more tight and reliable appraised values, but also trying to deal with the surges of appraisal needs that come out there, as we saw during COVID, which was really outside the realm of normality. But so we've got a couple of things. We've got hybrid and desktop assignments that were pushed out a year or two ago here. We have ANSI standard measuring requirements that have pushed out to appraisers, where before there was really no structure. We have this reconsideration of value process that is being laid out on there and executed on our behalf. So there's a lot of things that they're doing out there that appraisers are reacting to and making part of their process. But as we find, it's not easy implementing a lot of these initiatives as an appraiser, and largely because other market participants really aren't on board yet, or don't know, and that sort of thing. So we thought we'd talk a little bit about that. Why don't you start us off?
Yeah, you bet. So a lot of different things, taking place there, and those that obviously are creating the loans and then selling them to Fannie and Freddie are interested in what Fannie and Freddie say. I don't know how many in the real estate community maybe care as much about that, but there's one interesting initiative that I know I've heard the representatives from both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac talk about, and that being that they would love to have, and their vision, I think, of the future is that every time a real estate agent takes a listing, they produce a scanned image of the floor plan of the home that's being listed, and not just the image for visual purposes, but also for verifying the living area. The GLA is kind of the common vernacular there for the gross living area. One of the things that they want to do or accomplish with that is have factual data that around the size of the home that's consistent, that's up to date. Sometimes county records will be just wrong. Sometimes there have been modifications to the home that aren't reflected in county records, and those sorts of things. But one of the motivations that Fannie and Freddie have in doing this is to have accurate size information, because as they assess risk in taking on loans, they're not requiring an appraisal, or at least a full traditional appraisal, on every single assignment. Now, appraisers aren't happy about that, and I definitely understand where that sentiment comes from. Until I can influence Fannie and Freddie's policy decision making, when that seems a little ways down the road, I'm, if ever. But I think it's more a matter of adapting to where they're going than it is trying to tell them that they should want something different when that's going to fall on deaf ears, coming from you or I. But if they have that information, the GLA size calculation specifically, it allows them in their risk assessment to decide, do we need a full traditional appraisal? Can we do a desktop or a hybrid appraisal? And if real estate agents are scanning those, what it's going to do is allow for kind of faster turn times on getting an appraisal completed. If they say, hey, we don't have to schedule to get the appraiser out there to do it firsthand on site, we can take the information that's been produced already, give it to them. They can do the research, write the report, and send it without having to work in that inspection piece. One of the interesting things there, Mark, is that ability. It's not happening in the moment. I mean, I'll see a number of different types of scans or imaging that's there, Matterport and others have been doing that for a long time. But what they're specifically wanting on these is scanning apps and technology that are capturing this living area calculation consistent with the ANSI measurement standards, which they've adopted and they want applied universally as well. It doesn't mean that it'll automatically qualify for some alternative valuation product, but in cases where it would otherwise, having that scan will speed up the process, really.
Yeah, I did very much understand where Fannie Freddie were coming from the ANSI standard initiative. It's different. When we were launching our company, in planning to train people around the country to develop a consistent product, one thing was very clear to us is appraisers measure very differently all over the place in the same market, just depending on who you were trained and how you handle stuff. And that was a problem for us in what we were trying to do. So what do we point to as the standard that our appraisers would measure by? And ANSI was kind of the clear answer for us. So we were implementing that well before Fannie and Freddie pushed it out. But it was that need. And I can't imagine being in an underwriter's situation knowing that 15 different appraisers measure the same house, even a fairly simple one. You're going to get a different answer, certainly more varying answers before ANSI was put into place. And so how do you lend on that? Most of the time, it's a very small difference, so it doesn't make a big difference in value. But what happens if that difference becomes greater? Can happen by a unique feature on the subject that you're measuring. Maybe appraiser handles it differently, and it's 50 square feet off or whatever. So, it just makes sense to want to have that. And so what's ended up happening specifically on desktop assignments is that a floor plan with interior walls, not something appraisers have ever done, is required to complete a desktop assignment. And because realtors have not gotten the message to get those done, they just don't exist. And so, appraisers aren't super educated, even those that are trying to be really educated. I'd put myself in that. I'm trying to do it. But when it gets ordered, well, man, I've got a client that just ordered it and said, either you can do it or you can't. I'll find somebody that can if you can't. Well, if there isn't a floor plan available, I can't, right? Or can I go get the floor plan if I want to do the assignment? And so there's just all of this confusion that leads out there that puts appraisers in a really tough spot. It puts lenders and appraisal management companies in a tough spot. And really what is needed in that case is, like you said, we need floor plans. I think the intention is that floor plans are put together as part of the marketing package for listings out there. But people putting the listing packages together don't really know that or aren't doing it in large numbers. And so, this is a half execution in my mind of an initiative where you've got appraisers that have been informed, at least initially, of what's going on, but the rest of the market participants are not. And it puts it makes the product nearly unusable for those not in the know. I think there are a couple very large AMCs that have been involved in these processes from the beginning and seem to be having the market cornered. I don't see any of that work, so I don't know much about it, but it seems like volume's there. But in our world, we don't see much of it, and I think some of that is a result of initiatives not fully executed.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And because the floor plans don't exist, a lot of these aren't, maybe qualifying. I mean, but even those that I talk to that are originating loans, they're not ordering very many hybrids or desktops. Appraisers, many appraisers, hate the concept or the idea and want to be on the ground, seeing the properties, measuring the properties, which I totally agree, feel is the best case scenario, from an appraisal perspective. But I think that where there's a differing of opinion sometimes is that as long as an appraiser can do a credible job, within the context of a scope of work, it's okay to have differing levels of that scope. And some aren't comfortable with it, don't want to do it, and won't, and that's perfectly fine. I don't think anybody should be compelled to do it. But I do think that understanding what can be done and in part, why is it being done in the first place? I don't see it as being an attempt to eliminate appraisers from the process. Now, I may be proven wrong at some point down the road, but I don't see the evidence pointing, in that direction. But having the ability to provide what the market is asking for, I think is incumbent on anybody in a service industry, provided that it's within, the professional standards that you have and you're not, being unethical or things like that. There's been a lot of resistance to these from appraisers. I'm not seeing much volume yet. I do think that as mortgage rates get to a place where volumes pick up meaningfully, and especially in a refinance, era where Fannie and Freddie are likely going to have information on a home. If I bought it 2 years ago and there was an appraisal done, and they've got a floor plan, they've got information about what the home is, and it's a relatively low risk scenario, they may be ordering more desktops or hybrids or non-appraisal, products. From our perspective, would like them ordering the appraisal in some form or fashion. I think the volume of those will pick up in time. Maybe the last thing I'll say about that is I also see a very wide variation in what clients are willing to pay for that type of a product, from kind of the same thing as a full appraisal fee for a hybrid or a desktop form, all the way down to less than like $100 for that same form from a different client. And so part of the reason appraisers are really reluctant is when they hear desktop or hybrid, all they hear is ultra low fee, going to take not nearly the compensation on a dollar per hour basis is what they would on a traditional appraisal report. And so that's part of the reason they're reluctant for them. If the fees are commensurate with the time that's going to be spent, and most of the time spent is not necessarily in looking at the house, there's some inefficient time in driving back and forth and and doing those sorts of things. But I think that's part of the reason for the reluctance. But I do think we'll see the volumes increase as we go through a refi boom, whenever that happens to be.
Yeah, I think it is a release valve for busy times of appraisal ordering, and if when appraisal turn times get back up to 13, 14 days, if they do, this is a good release valve, similar to what we saw experimented with during COVID. And the problem, at least as I see it, I imagine some of the large appraisal management companies that have sort of honed in this line of business have gotten pretty quick with them, but they are not quicker than the 1004, at least as we produce the 1004. So not yet accomplished there, but I think has the grounds to do that if fully implemented and executed, and in those desktop or the floor plans and the things required are available there. So a lot of work to do, And so in the same vein, a good appraiser friend of ours, Brent, was explaining to us here a few weeks ago about the trouble he's having in his market, where having disagreements in value in his appraisal versus what a realtor thinks, a list price or a pending purchase price, and largely because he is measuring properties to ANSI standards, and that has never been near a thought of a realtor one way or another as they're putting the GLAs into the reports, which brings up a whole nother sidebar conversation that we are expected to use comps that measure GLA in the same ANSI framework, and that's a very difficult thing to know. And when Brent is describing situations where The realtor hasn't done that, is sort of shocked by the ANSI measurements and the results of that. That would certainly say that they are not using ANSI one way or another. They're using county records, which are decades old, most likely, and whatever the technique used, or owner, which can go a lot of different ways.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think, at the heart of why Fannie and Freddie are saying, hey, we need a data standard here, for the GLA, because when you're not comparing apples to apples in terms of the size, that's always going to be a problem. And, the most common valuation technique that I see, the real estate agent community use is look at a price per square foot, and then, in various ways try to account for, if there are meaningful differences in a view or a pool or a whatever, a bigger garage or whatever the market may be valuing there. But if you don't have that square foot piece right in the calculation, everything goes off the rails from there. And so as Brent and any appraiser around the country is having an agent say, hey, your value's wrong because this comp down the street sold for X dollars per square foot. Well, if that home is reported is reported differently and incorrectly in terms of size, you're going to have issues, no matter what you do. And this is not going to be an overnight, fix or adaptation. But I think kind of comes back to what we were talking about. If we get scans that are as applicable to ANSI standards as possible at the time of listing, it eliminates that potential for variation in, well, this listing just said it was 2,000 square feet, but when I measure it to ANSI, it's actually only, 1,500 or 2,500 or whatever. I don't often see variances that big, but they can be, and whether it should be above or below grade is defined specifically in ANSI, but many will take liberties of, well, it's finished space, and so I'm just going to lump it all in together, because the bigger, from a marketing perspective, you can say a house is, the higher the price and the better you've represented your seller, maybe at some level. But what I see happen is if you don't have it right in the first place, you list it, you get it sold at a contract price, the appraiser comes along, does the appraisal and says, look, this isn't all GLA according to ANSI. Then you've got a value dispute between what the appraisal is based on one measuring standard and what the listing agent took, based on a different standard or no standard at all or whatever. And at the end of the day, getting it right, facilitates getting the transaction done, more effectively and more likely, which is in everybody's interest when it's all said and done.
Amen. Yeah, that, this coming from a 2-decade-long super experienced measurer of houses, I've done, I don't know, 50,000 of them. I'm pretty quick at it. I'm pretty good, I think. But what I am not able to do is reproduce the GLA of a subject, exactly over and over again, and certainly not along with several other appraisers that are similarly skilled. I have to objectively look at what Kubi and the others are doing, is that it is generally a reproducible measurement. So you can start to point to a single answer that we all come to. They have plenty of mistakes and all of that. So of course there are what I think are more edge cases than not, but it does serve a purpose, and I can see where people are going, despite my dying skill.
Well, one of the things we've observed, and one of the hardest things to teach, is how to measure, a non-box type of a home consistently and well. And for some people, it's a little more intuitive than others. But even those that have been doing it as long as you or I, there's still room due to rounding and other, just process, features that might result in not coming to the exact square foot calculation. And I don't think anybody's really thrown off if on a 2,000 square foot home, somebody's, there's a variance of 10 or 20 square feet or something there, when it's much larger and when there's questions about should this particular piece of the house be included in the GLA or separated for some reason. That's where I think it starts to have a bigger impact on, on the value, the GLA estimate, and then all of the kind of cascading effects that that can come from that by not having it accurate. But it's a challenging skill. But you did say one word that was something I've heard the chief appraiser for Fannie Mae say specifically, and that's the ability to replicate the results. And I think these apps and the standards are honing in on that. And I agree. I've seen cases where they don't, where it's not consistent. It's usually unusual circumstances, and or a combination of not understanding how to operate the apps well. I mean, user error can be a factor in that as well. But as we get to a place where there's high enough confidence in these measurement standards, I think it will facilitate these transactions going through more smoothly.
Well, the most recent initiative, Jeff, from the GSEs, kind of in this vein, is the reconsideration of value. You've been talking to market participants recently, not appraisers specifically, but others in the space about this process coming through, and what you find.
It has blown my mind, frankly, Mark. I mean, not what I was expecting to find. So we had touched on this a little bit coming out of the Valuation Expo, because we had the representatives from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac talking about, hey, we need there to be, again, a kind of a standardized or a consistent way, an equitable way for people to say, hey, we think that there's an error in this appraisal and we think it should be relooked at. So them announcing that it's going into effect at the end of October, I thought, well, shoot, I'm going to reach out to some mortgage friends that I have, to see how they plan to implement, what their thoughts are. And I think there was one mortgage broker who said, yeah, I know this is coming. There are probably 5 or 6 others that I've talked to, whether in passing or whatever, that have no idea what we're talking about. Like ROV, like Fannie and Freddie are doing something. I don't know what that is. In fact, one guy had said, I just got off a call with my sales team and our leadership, and they haven't said anything about it. Like, this is news to us. Now, it's not that there haven't been, different ways to appeal a value or whatever. But what Fannie and Freddie are doing is saying, hey, there needs to be some consistency. There needs to be some standards. We talked a little bit about the rights and responsibilities on a previous episode of that the borrowers have, that the appraisers have, that the lenders have in this process. But it's been shocking to realize that the buyers of these mortgages in Fannie and Freddie are rolling this out. They're talking to the appraisers about it, which for us, it doesn't change a whole lot on the appraisal. We've gotten reconsideration requests. We look at the data, and if it should be changed, we change, and if it doesn't, it shouldn't. But those that are going to be the intermediary and on the lender side, that they're not even knowing like what's coming has really been surprising to me, Mark.
Yeah, it feels like it's going to at least start out in a similar way that ANSI standard initiative and the hybrid desktop initiatives have started out, where it's just a slow phased launch where appraisers understand it pretty well to start, but maybe other market participants not so much. And I anticipate that's going to be creating some confusion in the marketplace. So. Hey, a little feedback, Rachel, if you're listening, what we see on the ground doing this stuff. Yeah, so fascinating discussion, I think, Jeff, and major changes like this. Goodness, we have the new forms coming, I think, at some point. But all of the change and all of the initiatives, there is a lot of change happening at Fannie and Freddie, trying to adapt to kind of a modern lending and housing landscape, and that makes appraisers nervous. It certainly makes me nervous. I don't know what tomorrow holds specifically. They ensure us that appraisers are part of that future. I tend to agree, mostly because of the risk aversion of new initiatives by anyone in the space. There's just too much risk using artificial intelligence or whatever alternative valuation products that are out there. So that gives me confidence that we're going to be around for my career. Likely that job description changes quite a bit. It has been to some degree, but I remain optimistic about where things are going.
I just don't see many service industries and kind of knowledge industries that aren't being touched and impacted meaningfully by technology, by evolution and changes. I mean, it's easier to do what you've always done and always known forever, but I don't think that's a reality for most people, and at least, in this broad space. And so I think we're going to have to adapt. And, appraisers' jobs, I mean, we get paid to read markets and interpret them. And I think we just have to apply that same skill set to the market for our services as well. And it's uncomfortable, but I think it's just a reality. Competing in a marketplace is difficult. The market is kind of, doesn't really care how you feel about things, and you respond and adapt or die. And it feels like just hanging on, sometimes when you're trying to, survive, negative market circumstances or realities like, negative interest rates and low volumes that we've been dealing with. I think it's just the way, that it's going to be, or that it is competing in a market. I did just want to say that I think on this ROV thing, everybody should have the perspective that it's okay for an appraiser to change an opinion of value, provided there's relevant information that they didn't have initially. I think what happens is a lot of times comps will be thrown at an appraiser. The appraiser already had them. They're less similar than what the appraiser used, so there's not a change in the value. And then people feel like they haven't been heard, or that the appraiser just ignored them or something. On the other hand, I think sometimes I've seen appraisers dig in, where an agent says, hey, this comp that you used, there was something unusual going on with it. It was full of mold, or they had to go in and remediate for termites or something. And though I don't understand it, appraisers will dig in and say, no, it was a comp at the time, and I'm just going to use it, and I'm not going to change my mind. In the face of information that's new or that you didn't have, it's perfectly appropriate for an appraiser to change the analysis, change the value. And in that scenario, it's the right thing to do. I mean, that's what should be expected. If what's being provided for consideration, isn't any better, and oftentimes, I mean, you and I have seen this more often than not. I'm taking comps, or I'm given comps from a better neighborhood, or comps with homes with a pool, and saying, well, look at this price per square foot, even though my home, that I'm appraising doesn't have a pool. I mean, when you're just ignoring blatant information, you shouldn't expect, that there's going to be a change necessarily. But I think sometimes people expect that there's only ever one right answer on the appraisal, and it can never change regardless. And that's just not the reality that we live in. But you can't arbitrarily be changing them either if you don't have, good information and reason to do it.
Amen. Yeah, I think it's important, very important for appraisers to understand that. I think that is the one of the single biggest liability reducing things an appraiser can do. And make no mistake, there is enormous liability on every residential appraisal that we do, and we don't collect a lot of money on an individual assignment, given the amount of liability that's out there. I'll close, Jeff, just as we were talking a little bit on the future and the role of a residential appraiser in the lending space, the GSEs and all of that. I think a fundamental first principles truth in all industries that are modernizing kind of necessity is that speed and convenience is where everything is heading, and that appraisers ought to be that same speed and convenience. I think convenience means speed in a lot of these cases is where our industry too is seeking modernization one way or another. And so it is incumbent upon appraisers to acknowledge that truth and figure out how to deliver quality results while accomplishing that speed. And I think that is how our role is, at least in the mortgage space, that is how we protect our role.
Increasingly, there are tools out there to facilitate that specifically. I was talking at the Appraisal Summit about and highlighting a number of different tools that are available to appraisers. And I totally agree, Mark. I mean, it's leveraging what we have to provide a better, higher quality and faster service. And there are some appraisers that refuse to believe that's possible, and that's okay. But I think they're the ones that will be left by the wayside. They assume fast means poor quality, and it doesn't have to be, but in fact, it can't and it shouldn't be. But it takes some real intention, to elevate both, the speed and the quality simultaneously. But I'm 100% convinced that that's not only possible, but it's what it's going to take to be successful going forward.
Episode 14, that's a wrap, Jeff. Enjoyed it as usual. Look forward to connecting next week. I didn't know if I should preview our next episode. Not sure of the timing yet, so maybe I won't do that just yet. But we'll keep the mystery and intrigue there.
Something exciting forthcoming, maybe. We'll just play with some emotions and hopefully have somebody engaged to watch. But looking forward to it, Mark. It's a joy as always.
Those in the hurricanes, I hear good luck to you and wish a safe time this week.
Boy, absolutely. Thoughts and prayers there for sure.
All righty.
Thanks, Mark.